The New York Knicks need to build around RJ Barrett already. RJ is coming off a 46-point performance recently against the Miami Heat, and he's also coming off a really good game against the Sixers where he put up 24 points in that game. And I think overall how well RJ has been playing this season, on top of the fact that RJ is showing such an improvement this season compared to last, I think it's time for the Knicks to build around RJ Barrett already. But quickly before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetics.
It's been pretty clear that the New York Knicks have been a huge disappointment this season. I already made a bunch of videos on this, so I'm not going to touch upon it that much, but after making the 4th seed last year, there was a ton of expectations going into this year, and basically the Knicks not only disappointed in terms of not being a top 5 or top 6 seed in the Eastern Conference, they're not even anywhere near the play-in tournament at this point, and basically at this point they're just playing the youth and kind of just see where that takes them. Probably they're just going to end up tanking the rest of the season, and hopefully for their sake get a pretty good draft pick and add that player to their already pretty good youth in my opinion, and maybe make some changes in the offseason, maybe trade away a few guys, maybe bring in some nice free agents, and kind of just reset and go into next season with a fresh start. And in my opinion, I think the biggest question of the offseason is going to be what are the Knicks going to do with Julius Randle, because I already made a bunch of videos on this and I've given my opinion. I don't necessarily think Julius Randle is right for this team. I don't think he plays well with some of the younger guys on the team. I also don't necessarily think he can handle being the #1 guy in New York, and overall I just think it would make a lot of sense for both parties if the Knicks and Julius just parted ways. Maybe Julius can go to a different situation where he would be the 2nd or 3rd guy on a really good team, or maybe he would go to a different situation where he could potentially be the #1 guy, but it just wouldn't be in New York. I think that would be the best scenario for him personally, and for the Knicks, hopefully they can get some assets in return. As I mentioned before, get a good draft pick in the draft a good player, maybe get some pretty good players during the offseason, and just build from there. I think that would be the best case scenario for both sides in my opinion. And honestly, I don't necessarily think that the Knicks, although this season has been a very big disappointment for them, are necessarily the Knicks of old, where they kind of have no direction and are just going to continue to be bad for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think the Knicks are certainly in a much better situation now than they were back in the 2019 season or even prior to that. The young players that the Knicks have on their roster currently, I like a lot of the players that they have, especially RJ Barrett, of course, as I mentioned. Some of the other players on the team, I think they certainly have the capability to get better each and every season, and I think we've certainly seen that from some guys on the team. And overall, I still am pretty excited about the future of this team, but of course before the Knicks move forward, they just got to figure out what they're going to do with Julius Randle. But now let's get into the reason why you guys clicked on the video, and that is why the Knicks should build around RJ Barrett long term. Now when it comes down to an organization deciding which player they should build around long term, it comes down to a few different factors. Now of course the first and most obvious factor is their actual skill level. An organization needs to decide, is that player currently an all-star type player or a superstar type player, or is that player a younger guy that has a potential to be an all-star or a superstar type guy going forward? And if it's a latter and the player is a younger guy that has a potential to be an all-star or superstar type player long term, then the organization needs to figure out what that player's ceiling is in their opinion. If the organization sees that player as an all-star type guy going forward, you certainly could build around him in the short term, but long term you're not going to win a championship around an all-star type guy, and of course you're going to need a superstar type player to build around. But on the other hand, if the organization identifies one of their young players and sees that player as a superstar type guy long term, then you can certainly build around a player like that and build a championship contender around a player like that as well. Now of course in the new age NBA, you're probably going to have to add at least one all-star, maybe even a superstar around your franchise guy, and also some shooting and defense. But of course the first step in building a championship contender would be identifying that franchise player, and if one of your younger players on your team currently seems to be a superstar type guy long term, that's of course the first step. Now another factor in determining which player could be a franchise guy for you long term would be determining how all in that player is. If that player is just going to leave your team after a season or two, or just going to leave at the first opportunity they have, obviously it doesn't make sense to build around a guy like that, and it would make a lot more sense to just trade away a guy like that and get some assets in return, even if he's a superstar type talent and super talented obviously. Now I know this this seems pretty obvious, but it seems like a lot of organizations sometimes build around players who aren't necessarily all in and completely invested to their organization, and some of the players just leave after a few seasons, and a team that built around one of those guys is kind of just left with nothing in the end, or very little, I should say. Now, I know it's a lot easier said than done, but at the same time, I think a lot more teams need to do a lot more due diligence and see which players actually are fully invested into their organizations and which players are not. And just to go around the league and give you some examples of players who are fully invested and some players who are not fully invested, looking at a guy like Damian Lillard, I think he's probably the best example of a player who is fully invested to their team, and even though it has been pretty rough for the Portland Trailblazers, at least as of late, Dame has shown no desire to even think about leaving the Blazers, and that's exactly what you want as your cornerstone piece of your organization. And looking around the NBA to a player who's not fully invested, at least recently, it has to be James Harden, because of course he didn't want to stay with the Houston Rockets once it got tough, and then he went to the Brooklyn Nets, and once the situation with the Nets was getting tough, he wanted out again, and now is with the Philadelphia 76ers. And who knows what's going to happen with the Sixers? Maybe they'll win a championship, maybe they'll play great, and James Harden would want to stay there forever, but it just isn't a good look for him overall, and certainly he's not one of the players that you want as one of your cornerstone pieces, just due to the fact that he isn't necessarily fully invested with some of the more recent teams that he's been on. Now, the last and final factor in determining whether a player could be a franchise guy long term for an organization going forward or not would be, is that player willing to put in that extra work to becoming a superstar type guy each and every offseason after each and every game, and overall just cares about their individual game enough to continuously try to get better each and every season. Now, this point kind of piggybacks off the last point where they have to be all in and all invested. I think both of these points are pretty similar, but of course, if one of your franchise guys is a very talented player and certainly has a talent to be an all-star type guy and is a young guy, but isn't necessarily willing to put in that extra work to continuously improve his game and maybe get to that superstar level or even a top 5 player in the NBA, maybe at that level if he's that talented, then I don't necessarily think a player like that is worth building around, just due to the fact that whatever he is at currently, he's never going to get any better, and honestly, as the rest of the NBA starts to figure him out, he honestly might get a little bit worse. Now, we've certainly seen a few players like this around the NBA where going into the NBA draft, they were seen as an all-star or maybe even a superstar type talent just due to the amount of raw talent that they had, but once they got into the NBA, maybe they had a really good rookie season, but after that, the rest of the NBA started to figure them out, and they never really put in enough work to improve their game individually, and either stayed the same for a little bit or ended up getting worse as time progressed. And overall, I think once determining whether a player is a franchise guy for you, those 3 factors need to be checked off, at least in my opinion. And when you look at a guy like RJ Barrett, I think he certainly checks off all those boxes. I think it's pretty clear that he's completely all in with this New York Knicks team. I also think it's very clear that he continues to put in the work each and every offseason and really works hard on his game to continuously improve, and I think we've seen that from year 1 to year 2 and to year 2 to year 3, and I would expect that to continue from year 3 to year 4 and just continue on in general for the rest of his career. And as I mentioned, I think this season he's certainly playing at an all-star type level. Of course, he wasn't named an all-star, but I think the level of play, especially as of late, is certainly an all-star type guy, and honestly, I think if he continues to work on his game like he has been, he certainly has the potential to become a superstar type guy long term. So I certainly think the Knicks should look to build around RJ Barrett long term, and I think if they put the right guys around him long term, the Knicks certainly could be a much better team than they are currently and continuously get better each and every year. But we'll see what happens going forward for both RJ Barrett and the New York Knicks. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys think RJ Barrett is the face of the franchise and the Knicks should build around him long term, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetic. Hope you can't go where I'm headed.